Good evening, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World News Tonight. Moldova is gearing up for the second round of its presidential election. The incumbent pro-European Maia Sandu will face the pro-Russian candidate Alexander Stoianoglo. Moscow is attempting to influence the vote, which may either bring the country closer to the EU or throw it into the Kremlin's zone of influence. More on that in a moment, but first let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are neck and neck only 3 days before the most important election in the world. Brussels wants to return illegal migrants from Syria. Decisions on this matter will be made during Poland's presidency of the Council of the European Union. And a major change for the British Conservative Party. Right-winger Kamala has become the new leader of the Tories. Moldova's presidential runoff starts tomorrow morning. The residents of the Eastern European country will choose between a pro-European and more Russia-oriented future. Well, our correspondent, Marek Stil, is in Chisinau, the capital of Moldova. Good evening, Marek. So what is the atmosphere ahead of this pivotal election?
Good evening. Well, Moldovans are indeed preparing for this presidential election runoff, which, as you said, starts tomorrow. So the atmosphere here is quite tense because of the meaning of this election, because we'll see on the one hand Maia Sandu, the incumbent pro-EU president, face off a more Russia-friendly candidate supported by the Party of Socialists, former Prosecutor General Alexander Stoianoglo. So just 2 weeks ago, Moldovans voted in a referendum to add EU membership to the country's constitution, which took place along the first round of the presidential election. The outcome, 50.5% for adding EU membership to the constitution to 49.5% against, proved that there is no consensus here in Moldova about the country's future. The first round of the presidential election that accompanied this referendum was won by Maia Sandu, but she won 42% of the vote, so the highest number of votes, while Alexander Stoianoglo, her rival in the second round, received 26% of the vote, and he outperformed all expectations. Third came in a pro-Russian candidate with around 14% of the vote. So voters who voted for this third candidate may be expected to support Mr. Stoianoglo in the second round of the election. So the newest polls indicate that Maia Sandu is ahead Alexander Stoianoglo, and actually a recent poll, the most recent poll prepared by iData, shows three scenarios, and depending on the mobilization here in Moldova, among Moldovans abroad and in the breakaway province of Transnistria, they've identified three scenarios, and Sandu performance varied from 55% to 51% support, while Mr. Stoianoglo's was between 45% and 49%. So this may be a very tight race tomorrow. There's been evidence presented by the authorities of lots of foreign interference. This pertains to the first round of the election, but also currently. Dorin Recean, the Prime Minister of Moldova, reported yesterday that a wave of death threats was received by residents across the country, and this also included journalists. There were also SMSs being sent to people across the country, ordering them to vote in a certain way, and there were also SMSs that said vote for Maia Sandu, and the government here in Chisinau said that this was a disinformation campaign aimed at discrediting the incumbent president. The first round was marred by lots of foreign influence, and this was also reported by OSCE observers who were present here 2 weeks ago and are present here today. The president, Maia Sandu, said then that 300,000, up to 300,000 votes could have been bought by people, business people related to Russia. So what's at stake during this presidential runoff? Well, the runoff will definitely influence Moldova's path to the European Union. The country, let me just remind you, that has been stuck between East and West since 1991 when it gained independence. Moldova hasn't really decided whether it wants to be an ally of the Western world or whether it wants to be a Russian ally. But in 2022, Maia Sandu and Dorin Recean's government, so the current pro-EU camp, took a strong shift towards the EU when they applied for EU membership and were granted EU candidate status alongside Ukraine. So the question is now whether this path can be maintained. And another question is if foreign interference here, especially Russian interference, is high. Well, this also discredits Moldova as a potential candidate, as a potential EU member. What's also interesting is that Moldova is holding a parliamentary election next year. So this election runoff, which starts tomorrow morning, will be a test for the ruling pro-EU camp, whether they can secure a majority of votes here in Moldova. Back to you.
That was Marek Still reporting from Chisinau, Moldova. And of course, we'll keep you posted on the latest developments in Moldova. Thank you so much, Marek, for this extensive report. And from the election in Moldova, we turn our attention to election in the US. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk stated on social media, quote, "Some say that the future of Europe depends on the American elections. Well, it depends primarily on us." He also claimed that Europe must believe in its own strength.
Harris or Trump? Some claim that the future of Europe depends on the American elections. Well, it depends first and foremost on us, on condition Europe finally grows up and believes in its own strength. Whatever the outcome, the era of geopolitical outsourcing is over.
There are only 3 days left until the US presidential election. Both candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, are competing hard, trying to reach as many voters as possible in key states. And current polls do not indicate a clear winner. And so we move now on to Atlanta, where our very own Don Oliver is on the ground. Hello, Don. So what does the campaign look like in its final stretch?
Well, it is the final stretch, and it is quite exciting. So here in Atlanta, Georgia today, Vice President Kamala Harris came here to talk to crowds of thousands of people. Now, that's rally here in Atlanta, Georgia, just finished moments ago, about an hour ago. People were filling up and expressing their excitement. But really what's important here in Georgia is that today was the last day of early voting for citizens here. Now the only other time that they can vote will be on Tuesday. And get this, record numbers. Everybody is hoping, at least the Kamala Harris supporters are hoping, to flip the state. It is a swing state. Potentially it could be a blue state. So there was a lot of enthusiasm about that. But back to the final day of this early voting, more than 50% of registered voters have already voted here in the state of Georgia. Now, why we don't know these results, we do know that the elections are close. Donald Trump is also paying attention to Georgia. He will be appearing in Macon, the city of Macon, which is about 2 hours away from Atlanta, and he will be having a rally here. Of course, Vice President Kamala Harris is heading up to North Carolina today to also garner as much support as they can in this final stretch of the elections for the U.S. presidency in 2024. Now back to you.
That was Don Oliver reporting from Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you so much, Don, for this report. The U.S. elections may determine the future of Ukraine. Well, the Biden administration, along with Kamala Harris, have assured Kyiv of their continued support. Donald Trump says that he will end the war with one phone call. Meanwhile, Trump's vice presidential candidate says no to Ukraine in NATO. Piotr Miszczuk has more.
At an underground theater in Zaporizhia, actors put on a performance for a prominent poet killed in battle. They're adamant that the fight for Ukraine must continue, and that means strong international support.
I see two possible options: a future where we remember our heroes, speak Ukrainian and develop our culture, or we have no future.
Western allies often look to America's example when deciding how or whether to support Kyiv's war effort. So whoever becomes the next US president will have a profound impact on Ukraine's borders and everyone who lives within them. In 2023, Ukraine launched a counter-offensive against Russia from the mostly occupied Zaporizhia region. It was hoped the action would force out the Russian invaders, but now the aim is to hold out against relentless Russian attacks. Total liberation here and in other Russian-occupied areas no longer seems likely. But just as American technology and weapons were instrumental in Ukrainian progress during the counter-offensive, it is now essential in helping Ukrainian forces hold their ground.
It's much more effective. The damage it inflicts is much more than a Soviet one.
A change of American policy could result in the area becoming a demilitarized zone or even engulfed by Russian troops. The outgoing Biden administration has promised thousands of armored vehicles in the coming months, and Kamala Harris has suggested she would continue to provide military aid if she wins, although that could be constrained by a Republican Congress. Ongoing support looks much less likely under Donald Trump.
What about those who gave their lives? I see the end of the war only when we reach the borders of our country, as they were in 1991.
2 years ago, Lyubov's home in the frontline village of Komishuvakha was destroyed by invading Russian soldiers.
I would like a true friend of Ukraine to win the elections, the one who will continue to support us. But who it's going to be, I cannot tell you.
Lyubov's daughter and grandchildren fled to the US at the start of the full-scale invasion.
In China, Robert Fico continues his most significant trip of the year. One of the outcomes from the Slovakian Prime Minister's multiple-day visit to Beijing will be the formation of a strategic partnership between the two countries. Paweł Trzaskowski has this report.
Any country that wants to have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China is required to formally not recognize Taiwan as an independent nation. Although China and Slovakia already have 75 years of established bilateral relations, Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico chose to observe this precondition nonetheless.
Mr. President, Slovakia firmly upholds the One China policy, which is the foundation of our bilateral cooperation.
But One China is not the only policy on which Beijing and Bratislava seem to see eye to eye. During his visit, Fico said that, quote, China's position on the Ukrainian crisis is fair, objective and constructive. That's a softened reiteration of his statement for Russian state television given earlier this week.
He has openly said that it's the beginning of the war was because of the Ukraine and the Western world.
There are certain immediate benefits that follow this shared worldview.
I would like to tell you, Mr. Prime Minister, that China has decided to grant a 15-day visa exemption for Slovakian citizens to enter China. Mr. Prime Minister, you're a good and old friend of the Chinese people.
To help me shed more light on this diplomatic move, I asked Grigory Mesezhnikov, the president of the Institute for Public Affairs in Slovakia, about the possible aims of Fico's visit.
I think it will be aiming at domestic audience and to persuade them that he cares about perspectives of Slovak economy.
But Mesezhnikov tells me that most of the deals discussed were negotiated by the former Slovakian government. Therefore, Fico's visit is mainly a PR stunt aimed at a domestic audience. As for China, the potential benefit for such cooperation would be finding a stable partner in the European Union.
From this point of view, it's good to have reliable, from the Chinese point of view, partner in Central Europe, not like, let's say, Lithuania, other countries with critical setup to China. So from this point of view, Slovakia is really important.
And this is crucial in the wake of a growing rivalry between the EU and China. Earlier this week, the EU introduced additional tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles. The tariffs were introduced after a divisive vote in the European Commission. One of the 5 countries that opposed their introduction was Slovakia.
EU ambassadors are discussing the idea of voluntarily sending Syrians back to their country. The idea comes as the EU is beginning to adopt a tougher stance on migration. Several media outlets have reported that the European Commission presented the initial document on Wednesday, but the policy itself could be introduced next year during Poland's presidency of the Council of the EU. Kazimierz Łysiek has more.
Whether they come on dinghies from Africa and the Middle East, or are forced to the EU borders by the Belarusian regime. Migrants and refugees are one of the most hotly discussed topics in Europe in recent months. The first massive influx of migrants to the old continent came in 2015, when hundreds of thousands of Syrians fled from the civil war. Now the EU is considering implementing ways to encourage some of them to return to their homeland.
The desperation on the part of some EU member states is really to bring numbers down. It's as simple as that. Syrians are a large proportion of those arriving irregularly, applying for asylum. Almost all of them get it. So how do we reduce that? And how do we reduce the numbers that are here already?
Yet the situation in Syria is far from ideal. The regime of Bashar al-Assad continues to have a tight grip on parts of the country still under his control. The statistics provided by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees paint a grim picture as well. Syria remains the world's worst crisis in terms of displacement, with more than 12 million people forced to move. The number of refugees returning to the country also dropped by 25% in 2023 compared to the year before. But now thousands of refugees are crossing into Syria from Lebanon, fleeing the Israeli operations in the neighboring country. These men are helping others crossing the border, risking their lives.
No, I don't feel safe at all, because we work while constantly worried at what time the plane will strike and when will they hit us. We are always worried, and our families are displaced in Syria. We just want this situation to end.
According to the UNHCR estimates, close to 500,000 people have made the journey so far. More than 70% are estimated to be of Syrian nationality. For them, the trip back could also mean persecution from the Assad regime.
The risk is real. Documented cases are frequent and recent. I mean, Human Rights Watch put out a lengthy statement just a few days ago, providing examples of such abuses.
The discussion in the EU over migration and Syrian refugees is expected to continue in the coming months. In the first half of 2025, Poland will be taking over the presidency in the Council of the European Union. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk is one of the leading supporters of more coordinated efforts at curbing illegal migration in the EU. He recently proposed to allow member states to temporarily suspend the granting of asylum in special cases, a concept backed by other leaders in the bloc.
The UK's Conservative Party has chosen a new leader. Kemi Badenoch has firmly established herself on the right wing of what is already a right-wing party, which also reflects a larger trend in British society. Michael van Blomenstein reports.
The result was Kemi Badenoch, 53,806 votes, and Robert Jenrick, 41,388.
We didn't even hear the full result. As expected by most commentators, Kemi Badenoch beat her rival Robert Jenrick to become the next leader of the United Kingdom's Conservative Party. By choosing Badenoch, the Conservatives are doubling down on issues like Brexit, anti-immigration and self-proclaimed anti-woke.
Our party is critical to the success of our country. But to be heard, we have to be honest. Honest about the fact that we made mistakes. Honest about the fact that we let standards slip. The time has come to tell the truth.
Feeling the heat from Nigel Farage's far-right Reform Party, Conservatives have drifted further right since being voted out of government last July.
Whether that gets the Conservative Party elected, we'll see in the next few years. But I do think it means that the Conservatives now are sort of tying themselves to the hard right in British culture for some time to come.
The shift comes despite Britain's exit from the European Union not delivering the economic benefits that politicians promised. What is known as Brexit has reduced trade between the UK and the EU, and the drop has become worse in recent years.
This suggests that the transition in UK-EU trade relations post-Brexit is not merely a short-term disruption, but reflects deeper structural changes likely to persist.
Badenoch's Conservatives are not the only ones hanging on to Brexit, though. Despite their conciliatory gestures, rejoining the European Union is not part of the plan for the current centre-left Labour government either. Still, a future Badenoch cabinet is likely to return to a more confrontational style towards the EU.
I think the one exception to that, at least for the UK and probably for a good section of the Conservative Party, is on security issues.
The attitude of Brits towards the around 4 million immigrants from EU countries has also changed. Poles, the single largest EU immigrant community of around 900,000, especially experience difficulties in some parts of the country.
A friend of mine told me she's a little bit worried about speaking Polish sometimes on the street, but I think it really does depend on where you are. Definitely, it's more difficult, I feel, to get a job or to go to uni after Brexit, because obviously you've got much more documents needed.
It remains to be seen how Britain's main opposition party is going to fare under their new leader, and whether Badenoch can exceed the staying power of her predecessors.
One of the most important votes in Moldova's history is due to take place on Sunday, with the incumbent president Maia Sandu fighting off a pro-Russian challenger, Alexander Stoianoglo, in the second round of the presidential election. Will Moldova stay on its pro-European path, or will it make a quick U-turn to head east? Well, to discuss the upcoming election, we are joined by Grigol Julukidze, an associate professor at Caucasus University in Tbilisi. Good evening.
Good evening, Maciej.
So, first of all, can Maia Sandu be sure ahead of the vote? Well, what do the polls tell us? And are the polls to be trusted in Moldova?
It's very difficult to trust into polls and exit polls because of the complexity of the situation in Moldova. Let's analyze the situation. For example, if other Kremlin-friendly parties swing their support behind Alexander Stoianoglo, the second round will be extremely close. Before last month's votes, Ilan Shor, a Russian-backed oligarch, offered to pay people for working to elect a Russian-friendly candidate and stop the referendum passing. Sandu said that the scam sought to pay off some 300,000 voters, about 10% of the population. Apart from vote buying, and analysts say the first round revealed genuine opposition to Sandu, whose first term has been wrecked by successive crises. First, there was the COVID-19 pandemic, then there was Russia's war in Ukraine, then there was the gas crisis. Although Sandu has weaned Moldova off Russian gas, it came at a heavy cost to one of Europe's poorest countries. Inflation rocketed to more than 30%, causing poverty to tick up. Some have also criticized Sandu's decision to hold the EU referendum on the same day as the presidential election, positioning herself as the only politician capable of bringing Moldova into Europe. And the plan of the government was that the issue of European integration will drag up the support for Maia Sandu. It turned out other way around. The discontent with Maia Sandu dragged down the support for European integration. And Stoianoglo right now is attempting to capitalize on discontent with Sandu by keeping one foot in both camps. He has called for a reset of relations with Moscow and said would be willing to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin while maintaining his committed of joining the EU. As a result...
Yes, but this reset you are talking about could also mean the very reset of relations with the EU. And therefore, here's the question about the importance of tomorrow's vote, because we already know that Moldovans have voted to stay on a pro-European cause in the last referendum. But the question is whether the next president if Stoianoglo in fact gets elected, can turn the country from this pro-European path?
Sure, definitely. If Stoianoglo is elected as the future president of Moldova, we'll see big sliding in relations with the West, and the Russian influence will be growing on a daily basis. It means that we will lose, much likely, another Eastern Partnership country.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, during the last parliamentary elections in Georgia, the ruling party was trying to spread fears about about the so-called war party, right? That you either vote for us and we guarantee you peace, or you either vote for the opposition, which basically means a future war with Russia. Now, it seems that this strategy has worked in Georgia for the ruling party. Now, is the opposition trying to use the same leverage in Moldova?
I find a lot of similarity in modus operandi because it comes from the Russian and Kremlin playbook. But the topic of war is less relevant in case of Moldova. The main issue is the economic conditions and situation in Moldova, which is worsening because of the above-mentioned reasons. That's why the similarities are between Georgian parliamentary elections and Moldovan presidential elections. And the main, let's say, thing which these two countries have in common before these key political events is the massive polarization of the political background. Either you vote for us or you are against us. There is no space for alternative solutions and way out from this situation. Everything is portrayed in black and white colors. Mm-hmm. By the way, Russians are very sophisticated and effective in these issues to radicalize and polarize the societies. And they're doing it successfully in Moldova as well, unfortunately.
Right, as we're already talking about Georgia partly, I'd like to ask you about the near future of your country. Well, after many calls from President Zurabishvili and opposition activists, Georgia's Central Electoral Commission will recount the votes. Now, do you think this may change the outcome of the election?
I don't think so. One of the main reasons for the success of the ruling party is very ineffective opposition. First of all, they created an expectation if more than 2 million Georgians vote, the government will be replaced. Which did not come true. Apart from that, they created the narrative according to which it is impossible to falsify the elections, but the day after they were providing different arguments in this regard. Apart from that, they started to, let's say, celebrate their victory after the public opinion polls and exit polls, and 1 hour after they claimed that the elections were stolen. It means that they were very poorly prepared, and I have the impression that their level of preparation is still very low when it comes to the demonstration of alleged falsifications. That's why I don't think that this issue might change anything. The only thing that right now opposition is able to do to create a political crisis, which may lead to the, let's say, early parliamentary elections. And I remind you that if the Georgian Dream, the ruling party, does not manage to collect 100 members of parliament, the parliament will not be effective, will not be able to adopt different resolutions, create parliamentary groups. It will be almost paralyzed. And that's why the only strategy in this direction is the boycott, as I see from the opposition actions and statements.
A boycott, that's one of the options, definitely one of the options. Grigol Julukidze, Associate Professor at Caucasus University, was our guest this evening. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. That is all the news for now, and stay with us for much more here on TVP World.